Hey guys, welcome to a new episode of the KMS Quick Shots. My name is Flo, and my guest today is New Orleans-based producer Jason Van Pelt, better known as Sophrosyne. Jason, thanks for joining me today.
Of course, glad to be here.
So you describe your music as percussive electronica with New Orleans roots. Tell us about your signature style and how you developed it.
Sure. I think where New Orleans comes into this, and I'll give a little bit of background on that. So New Orleans is located in Louisiana in the U.S. It's a very different kind of city, I think, from the rest of the country. In a lot of ways, it's very kind of Mediterranean, Caribbean, African influenced city. It's much more of a diaspora, and lots of different cultural elements to the extent that it's going to become its own culture over a period of a couple hundred years, right? And Carnival is a big thing here. Festivals, it's a very kind of tropical environment. And so we're outside a lot. We spend a lot of time just spending time with each other, I think, as a city. And that kind of Carnival and Mardi Gras aspect of living in New Orleans has always had a big influence on me. I think a big influence on everyone in the city, honestly. And so I grew up in that environment and listening to that kind of music. New Orleans has a very signature style of music that I think expands beyond jazz into things that are, like I said, much more Caribbean in style in terms of percussion and brass bands and drum lines and things like that are a big thing here, right? Like Mardi Gras parades are huge, and so that sound of Mardi Gras parades has kind of influenced my music over time, which was a big departure from where I started. But I felt like infusing kind of 90s, 2000s style electronica, which is, what I was doing when I was younger in my 20s, with some of what I learned growing up with, was kind of a distinct sound that I could utilize and grow with.
So this Mardi Gras feeling, I guess it's best to describe, is also reflected in the music itself over there. So in the location, like are there even influences in rock or in, I don't know, pop hearable that is from New Orleans?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I would say more recently, New Orleans has a huge influence in terms of, funk music, which was huge in the 70s, and that led into rap and hip hop in a lot of ways. A lot of hip hop music sampled from funk music, bands like the Meters especially, and they've always been a huge influence for me in terms of the style of percussion that they used, their bass lines. And yeah, so you hear that a lot in rock music, in rap music, and I think in electronica as well, that there's a lot of crossover between them.
So the special mixture that young Jason found interesting in his music and created this electro part with the, I describe it as playfulness of the sound itself, of soundscapes. Why did you choose to merge these two different vibes together so closely? Why not just doing small little passages in your tracks, for example, like, oh yeah, let's make a break and this sounds like that? Because your music is a wholesome thing, and it's a signature style of yours.
I think, well, a lot of where I was coming from when I first got into recording music and making music was starting with bands like The Orb and Orbital and Me Beat Manifesto and Ison and things that were very electronica based. And like you said, it's kind of spacey. And the transition for me was, I think, in how I like to use percussion in particular, that I create very dense drum beats and very varied drum beats. Rhythm is a huge aspect to my music, and that's the part that I think comes from my New Orleans background. You wouldn't necessarily recognize it if you're just listening to it, but I think if you know where it's coming from, it makes sense. And so I took those kind of early electronic influences and blended them with that penchant that I have for, those kind of complex drum patterns. And I think that's where my sound really kind of evolved into becoming something different.
When was the first time that you realized, okay, until now I was just playing around and creating some, I don't know, textures or synth melodies, but now I'm seeing myself as a musician?
Oh, let's see. I don't know that there was a time that necessarily like there was a switch. I think it was just gradual. I was working a lot on music in the early 2000s. Actually, I suppose late 90s and into the early 2000s. And I produced a couple of albums back then. You know, I had a lot of friends. This is when I was living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin here. And I had a pretty good group of friends and collaborators that I worked with there. And so it was kind of just something that happened naturally, you know, that as I was working on music, it started to collect, and I put out a couple of albums and EPs, and then my kids were born. And so, you know, in the early 90s, I kind of started transitioning away from working as much on music, trying to focus on other things. Like I mentioned before, I call the, you know, I've got a full-time job as a developer and I paint as well. And so it's, for me, it's always been a balance of all of those things. Music, family.
That explains the gap between 2005, your first album, I guess, and the 2020 second album. So,
Yeah.
no,
Well, part of that is also
was...
space. Yeah, I think it was between 2005 and 2020, you know, and well, I started working on that album probably 2018, right? But yeah, there was a pretty big gap, and a big part of that was kids. A big part of that was not having a space. And so, you know, I built this studio that I'm sitting in and working in. And once I had a space set up, that helped. A lot of it, and this will come up again, I think a little later, is that I had a friend, you know, a good friend of mine, who had come to New Orleans as well from Milwaukee. And he got me back into working on music. He actually came in and did a set in my studio space. And that just kind of got things clicking for me. And I pulled my equipment back out and just kind of dove back into it.
With what equipment did you start back then, and how did this equipment grow over time to your nowadays setup?
Interesting question. You can see some of my equipment behind me. My first piece of equipment was a Boss DR5, which was a drum machine that had a 4-track essentially built into it. It was drums and, you know, 3 instrument tracks that I started just learning how to do, you know, multi-tracked recording, right? Not focusing so much just on drums. And that's this piece over here that I still got and I still use. It's a pretty signature part of my sound. And I really love that machine. I don't use it for much anymore. Just I think a few drum sounds, you know, mostly my hi-hats and my snares come out of that. But that's where I started. And then over the years, I started building up more gear. I got a couple of, you know, these Korgs. This is another one of my older pieces that was starting to get into, is when the industry was going towards more of that digital analog crossover, right? And I'd say now where the industry is very much about those more organic analog types of sounds and synthesizers that they're building. And so when I came back into writing music in 2017, 2018, I leaned pretty heavily into that. I got some new equipment so I could leave some of my old sound behind. There's a line that Roland does called the Roland Boutiques that are kind of like recreations of some of their older synths. And I've got 3 of those now. And I kind of avoided it for a little while, but there's also the Korg Volca line, which is these really small synths and drum machines that kind of have a single purpose. But if you pair them together, you can make a nice little kit with them. And so that's kind of where I am. It's a lot of small pieces of equipment, but I don't like to have, I don't have space for a room full of synthesizers with keyboards and everything is its own piece. You know, I'd rather have, you know, 1 or 2 controller keyboards and small pieces that generate sound, but don't, you know, I don't need sequencers and like everything built into every piece of equipment.
If you happen to sell all your hardware, would it be possible even for you to to do those sounds with just software synthesizers like the Novation series or something like this?
It's hard to say. I think it's possible. You know, years ago, I did get a little bit into using software since some of the Novation synthesizers like V Station and the Bass Station, which I actually really loved. And I was using those through Ableton and Cubase. But when I came back to music, I made a decision that I didn't want it to be computer based, right? I'm still using Ableton essentially as my sequencer and my arranger. You know, I do all of my MIDI recording there, but I don't use any software synthesizers. I think that there's some warmth that comes out of using, I was going to say analog equipment. It's not fully analog, right? I mean, it's still hardware, you know, but it goes through wires, it passes through a mixer. And I think that semi-analog approach still brings a warmth to it, and a hands-on tactileness to it as well.
So you told me earlier that you are also drawing and painting. Would you say this creative aspect is one of the keys with using the hardware instead of the software regarding the tactile aspect?
I have never really made that connection with music, I suppose, and how it connects to art, but I think so, honestly. You know, I don't want to talk too much about the art side, but you know, the way that I paint is I often start with, or I always start with Adobe Illustrator. Now I'm doing it on an iPad with a pen, right? And so that feels more like actual drawing, but still, as I started building up my art years and years ago, I had to make a decision of whether or not these pieces that I was making in Illustrator, do I just want to print them and that is the art, or do I want to transfer them to canvas and actually paint them? And I very distinctly made that decision that I wanted to be working by hand on a canvas, because there's something about allowing for that humanity and the fact that you can't be perfect, right? And you're going to be able to see brushstrokes and you're going to be able to see imperfections. And yeah, I think that there's a definite crossover there with my music as well, as especially with this last album, that
that's what
very
I was
intentionally.
Yeah, that's what the next question I was wanting to ask. Do you have parallels between the creating art part and the creating music part on the other hand? How is the usual process of creating any music track like for you?
I kind of feel like that's where the parallels stop, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I think that I like that there is that element of humanity to it, right? That I allow for imperfection. You know, I think with this last album, what I was going to say is that there's a lot of that in there, space for things to change and grow. I'm working a lot less with loops and a lot more with just, you know, improv and playing things straight out. And, you know, if I'm using a loop, it's usually 32 measures long, something like that, versus, you know, a 2 or 4 measure loop where you can just hear the same thing happening over and over, you know. So even with simple things like hi-hat patterns or snares, you know, I like to play them, you know, on my, you know, controller keyboards, whatever, on my drum pads, and find, you know, segments of what I've played that, you know, that have a consistent sound to them, right? They don't sound broken, but they also aren't the same really basic pattern repeated over and over. I like that variation.
So would you say the actual album reference material, is this, I don't know if it's possible to answer that. Is this your best work yet, or is it a process of albums that paved the way, so to speak? So is there any album so far that you are most proud of?
I definitely think it's the best work that I've done. It's funny when I go back and listen to my last album that came out in 2020 called Parades, yeah. Which was obviously very heavily influenced by that New Orleans sound. I felt like that album worked really well if you listen to it from front to back, but it didn't do a good job of allowing you to pick songs out of it that you might put on a playlist or shuffle through, right? That
Mhm.
it kind of lended itself more to being just listened to as an album. And so I was more intentional this time around about creating songs that could be distinct songs, but that could also, flow and seg well together. So I think that this album does a better job of having songs that stand on their own.
Why
It's funny because, oh, sorry, go ahead.
why even produce a full album instead of just throwing out single songs there?
That's a good question. I think it's funny when we talk about music promotion and the way that things work on Spotify and other platforms. The more I learn about them, the more it feels like what they really want is single songs, and they want constant updates, which I feel honestly is kind of unfortunate. I think that an album, even though the songs are meant to stand on their own and be individual pieces, an album is in itself an experience, right? And I think the thing that I would relate it to is, I grew up listening to the Beatles' Abbey Road with my mom, right? And she introduced me to tons of music. But when you listen to Abbey Road, obviously side 2 in particular, it is one continuous piece. It's individual songs, but they all flow together. And that approach of making an album has always really spoken to me. And I think that the way that I work with creating songs, that I identify, I'm starting with this rhythm, then I'm going to put, additional pieces on top of it until it's full, so to speak, like every part of the sound range is accounted for. I think that you can think of an album as the same way, that, you've got highs and lows and in-betweens that you have to bridge through. And I think that an album can be seen as a whole work that is made up of its parts. And to some extent, listening to an album, from beginning to end, what is the phrase, that it is greater than the sum of its parts, right? And that it becomes more of an experience.
So, like you just said, the people out there, or the whole music scene out there, likes those single tracks because of the constant feed of updates, news, and tracks. So knowing your music so far, and taking what you just told me, how you approach the songs, I'd say you're a bit of a thinker. So putting a lot of thought into each song, even sonically, the sonic message of it, like telling a story part.
Yeah.
So is this actually a staged move, like a plan you use, or is this the way you are? So are these tracks parts of who you are?
It's funny. I think they're a compulsion, really. That's something that just needs to come out, and this is the way that it happens. I do think that there is, as you alluded to, that there's a storytelling aspect in the way that I like to create, and some of that is a reaction to a lot of electronic music is very much just about, a quick tempo and a beat and, effects that shift over time. And it's not so much about melody and being a song, right? And so I like to have a certain narrative aspect of approaching the song as a melody and thinking of it as the different parts of the song, the different instruments as they come in, that they all have part of that story to tell. And as you listen to the song, you kind of hear them almost speaking to each other, and one comes in for a little while and it becomes the most active voice, and then it might recede into the background and let something else come in and start telling its side of the story, or respond in a way. And so the songs themselves, I think, transition over time with, these different sounds, these different instruments kind of communicating to each other. And to me, it becomes very deep, and it's something I can, what my music is really for is me to listen to on my headphones when I'm laying down, right? And I get absorbed into it, and it's almost meditative. But it's not meditative in a way that, like, ambient, like drone songs are. It's still very active. And I just as easily can put my headphones on and do the dishes listening to it.
Mm-hmm. That being said, have you made the experience from your music? Is the music recepted in the way you intended, or are there even times where someone approaches you, let's say a blogger or some kind of person, that gives you a description or how the song makes him or her feel, and you're going like, that's really not what I wanted to feel though.
I mean, it's an interesting question, right? When you submit your music on a platform like Submit Hub or Muso Soup, or like to curators, I find that the reaction is all over the place, right? Some people will tell you like, I love the way that this is produced. It sounds really great. And other people say, I feel like this is, homemade, quote unquote, or, it's so subjective the way that it's received. And I think the difficult part for me is the people who relate to it best are the people that I've known for the longest, right? People that are good friends that I've been working with, other musicians over time. And so I think that they know my intention and how to listen to it and kind of what I'm trying to accomplish, right? Others who are, I think, more unbiased come with opinions that are all over the place. Like I said, they might comment on the production and have very different reactions to what they hear, or they might listen to the melodic flow of the song, and some of them think this is really full and it's really speaking to me, and others say, I just really feel like this is missing something, or it needs like some top line that's going through the whole song that's kind of grabbing me, and this isn't doing it. To some extent, I think it's really just what type of music do they listen to, and are there similarities that are lacking, right? Are there things that they want to hear that they're not, versus what is this song trying to accomplish, and is it accomplishing it, successfully?
From the artist's point of view, is it hard to take in all those different opinions, or is that in the end what you wanted to do with the music in the first place?
I think in terms of critique, I don't have a problem with taking criticism, and part of that is I think more of my training in art, because critique is a huge part of art and putting your work before other people. It's the same thing in music for sure, but I think when you're making music, especially when you're getting to the point of putting it in front of curators, it's kind of done, right? And I can accept that criticism and put it in the back of my head so that when I make new music in the future, I can hear some of that response and adjust. But I think that for the most part, as musicians, we're not putting our music out there to say, listen to this, and then I'm going to take that feedback and go change the song, right? By that point, the songs product, or the albums are kind of done, right? And you're trying to promote it, and you're trying to, honestly, to find a way to have the music be heard.
Yeah. Speaking of
did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I always think if you put it out there, it's like telling, I don't know, a factory that produces toasts to take the product back and change the topping or something like this. So it's there, it's finished. And I also think you have to be open-minded about critique, and it's not easy for, at least for me, it isn't, to take in critique that isn't necessarily going where I wanted to go with the work in the first place. So I'm always trying to hold back on my initial reaction before I'm going out there and say, okay, I think I know what you mean, and thank you for the thoughts on that. But I think with all those different opinions coming back to you, it also can be confusing, I guess. So if one part says we love that and the other part says we hate it, so what does this make your music? It's just on you to decide whether or not to even take those opinions, or just let them stand out there and say, okay, but it's my music. So that's why I was asking.
I think that there's an aspect of having to find your audience, right? And it's hard, I think, initially to know that if your music is not resonating or your art is not resonating with someone, that it's not because it's necessarily bad. There might be growth that's needed, right? And they might be pointing out that there is growth that you could pursue. But it's also that some people like some things and some people like other things. And if they're not responding positively, it's because they're not your audience, right? And I think finding the audience is the hardest part. And when you read about how to promote your work, that's kind of where everyone starts, is finding your audience and then figuring out how to speak to them. Finding your audience, though, is honestly the hardest part. Not necessarily knowing who's going to like your music, but how to reach them.
Yeah, speaking of promotion, you told me earlier that you are doing the promotional part of your music as well for your on your own. After gaining experience in that sector, would you even recommend other musicians to do this as well?
I think that you can't not. I think that that's where labels and record companies come in terms of, if you're not capable of promoting your own work, then you need somebody else to do it. But your music has to be promoted somehow, right? And if you are capable of doing it, then you really have to lean into it. And it's not easy, and it's very time consuming, and it's taxing, and yeah, it can be discouraging. As you alluded to, it can be rewarding as well. But I think the frustration that I find in working with promotions is more just the way that the system is set up, right? That it's very much about what you might call gatekeepers, right? And curators. That it's very much still, it's not in the record label's hands the way that it used to be, and radio stations. It's just that it's shifted to online platforms, Spotify obviously being the biggest one. And if you're not able to get your music into a Spotify editorial playlist, then it's going to be hard for you. And if you're not able to get your music into a playlist that's made by, a user, a playlister who has a large audience or a large following, it's going to be hard for you, right? And so that's where platforms like Submit Hub, etc., come in. But
they're also just part of the plan.
Sure.
So it's just a fracture of promotional aspect for artists out there.
Yeah, and I think the hard part is figuring out what you need to actually do, right? That there is a step, in my line of work building websites, what we call a bill of materials, right? That there are, a set of assets that you need to create. Essentially, you need to create a press kit, right? You need to create a bio and an album description and videos and posts for your social, and you have to write emails and you have to reach out to curators. And like, if you try to do that one by one, that makes it really difficult and especially time consuming. I think that there's some aspect of writing about your music in a way that is flexible, so that when you're reaching out to people, you've got words that you can use, right? And then you have to figure out who it is that you want to reach out to and what's the best way. And it does need to be personalized to whoever you're sending it to, right? They need to know that you know who they are and that you feel like they're the right person for you to reach out to, that you're not just throwing a really wide net and seeing who you catch.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you do have to throw that net and try to catch some people who fit with your style and what you're trying to build. And, like I say, you want to try to find, somebody with a megaphone, somebody who's got a loud voice that can speak up for you. Yeah. Because as artists, especially, new or emerging artists, we don't have that loud voice yet, right? But we have to hope that the quality of our work is going to speak for us.
There's just too many fish in the sea. So with what was the number of 6,000 songs a day on Spotify or something like this? That you,
I wouldn't doubt it. Yeah.
That you cannot track out there. If you're just an avid music lover, you're just able to listen to so much new music. So yeah, it's
I also think that there's a certain aspect of websites and radio, especially independent radio, that talk a lot about supporting independent artists. And it is true, to some extent, but there's also, I think, still this innate, not need, but just pull, I think, for people, curators and gatekeepers especially, right, to still lean into what's popular, or what's trending, or just, whatever sound is the sound right now. And
Yeah.
so that it still makes it hard for people who are independent or have, a different sound to get noticed or rise to the top.
Mm. Yeah, because at the end of the day, for every gatekeeper or promoter, the numbers have to be right, right?
Sure.
So if he or she knows, okay, I'm not going very far with this kind of sound, then you're off the table. And that's, I think, if the industry has its flaws, that would be one of the main flaws about it, because we're just having this, I don't know, 4 genres to get put into, either your pop, rock, and so on. And if you're not fitting into one of these schemes, you're as good as out of the door. So that's just, yeah.
That's very true. And that's a lot of the feedback that I get on my music is, what I've learned is we like to think as artists that a term like genre defying is a good thing, but honestly it's not. When you submit your music, a lot of times it's, hey, this is really great, I love this sound, but it doesn't fit with my genre of playlist, and so thanks but no thanks. And that's, I think, 90% of the response you get is, this is great, doesn't fit.
Yeah, and that's for small blogs like mine, it's where the fun starts, is if someone takes 2 genres and blends them in a way you won't hear every other day out there. So I think like, oh, that's interesting. That stands out for me, but the masses out there will reject it because it's just not what they are used to hear every day.
Right.
So, well, I think we could talk for hours about the flaws of the industry, but we won't. Next question would be, what are the future plans right after you released reference material at the end of the year, or was it the beginning of? No, it's out from December.
End of the year.
Right. So any plans yet?
Well, I would say this: when I finished my last album, I kind of thought, like you mentioned, it had been a long time since I had worked on music, and I thought, I'm just going to make this album and then put it away for a while. And then a couple of months after the album was released, I found myself back in the studio. It was kind of a surprise to me, honestly, and it was unplanned to make reference material to this album. And I'm kind of coming out of making reference material with that same thought, right? That I need to put it away for a while to focus on other things. I kind of feel like I've got a full-time job and 2 part-time jobs, between art and music. And I don't know, I'm not closing the door to making more music, and I keep having these thoughts of, next time I'm going to do this. And, so I know that it's coming, but I don't have a plan right now to start recording yet.
Okay, so you just finished promoting reference material, and from there on, I guess we have to wait and see.
Yeah, and the promotion is so much work on its own, and it's, rewarding in its own way. But yeah, I think once I'm through that process, then the idea of turning the machines back on and starting to play, I think will come back.
I saw on the socials a picture you posted where you folded all the descriptions, or you sent out the CDs to radio stations and stuff, and there seemed to be nothing rewarding about that, except of course the fact if they answer you and giving you positive signals. But I think you have to really see this as rewarding, like you do, the time you do it, because other people would just think as those as tedious tasks or something like this. So,
yeah, and I've tried to make a pretty conscious decision that for myself, it's not about the results, but it's about the process, right? And I think that comes kind of naturally to me as an artist, that it's about making the thing. That's what I enjoy, right? And so doing the promotions themselves, I see as a project, right? And I'm making a lot of things. I'm making videos and taking photos and all the things that I'm doing on social media. It's all part of the process, and I want to enjoy the process and document it. So much that when I look back 20 years from now and I remember making this album that I've got some record of what went into making and talking about the album and telling people about it, right? So it's, of course I want to see results, and it really excites me that, my local college radio station has picked up the album and started playing it and things like that. And I've got, friends that work in other radio stations, so I've gotten some airplay. But it's, again, it's hard to get attention. Like you said, there's 6,000 new songs coming out on Spotify every day. It's the same thing with, college radio or independent radio stations or anybody else that you send their music to. They're constantly getting submissions, and they all, for the most part, have policies that they're going to listen to everything that they receive, but not that they are going to dedicate lots of time to it and understand it and say, okay, I understand where this fits and we're going to promote this now.
Yeah, one part of the deal would be the personal approach you mentioned before, because if they got such a stack of new tracks on their desks, they will sort out anything that starts with "Dear Sir" / "Madam," because no.
Yeah, for sure.
Someone has to do his or her homework to just figure out who am I going to sending this to. Check the web page for the names. They are all on there. So guys out there, this is a warning. Just make your homework. And once you got, there are several stages, I guess, you got to do one at a time and start by the personal approach, and of course do great music and stuff like this. So I guess, like you said, it's the best part to approach it is to see the way you do it as the result, as well as the end goal is not to be famous and have I don't know, a yacht, but it's just the process itself.
I think it's about being thorough with your outreach, and it's about being honest and authentic, right? And if you're creating for yourself, which I think most of us are, right? We're our own first audience. Then make the thing that you love, right? Make the thing that you want to hear. And if it's a good quality and and it resonates with other people, then I think that's, always a benefit. But I've never gone into working on music thinking that I'm going to make any money off of it. Honestly, it's not a goal to make money. What I would like personally is to have my music heard and appreciated, and so that's more what the promotion is about, is how do I get it out there so that others can hear it and hopefully enjoy it.
So you got to promise me that you don't, whatever you do after the promotion part, that you don't pack away all those hardware for too long, because you get half a year or a year maximum, but then we expect a new album.
Well, it was 2 years in between these two, which it felt really long, to be honest. Knowing that I started this one pretty soon after the last one came out, it took quite a while, and the album was finished 6 months before it actually, was released, so that I could start putting together that plan, etc. But yeah, I think it won't be too long until, I start feeling that pull.
I really hope so. So, Jason, thank you very much for meeting me today. Guys, if you want to know more about Sophrosyne and his projects, make sure to check out the links in the description of this video or the description of the podcast. That's it for the night. Be safe. See you next time. Bye.
Thank you.